This prompt is called Defining Art. And so the premise of this lesson is for you to think about how you can draw and paint on another surface. So you don't have to start with a blank surface in order to create imagery. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find a surface. It should already have imagery or text on top of it. So a good example might be a dictionary page or a page from a book. Magazines work okay, but magazines are often very shiny, and so they often have to be treated before you can use them. You could use a map or a newspaper, a food wrapper, anything that you could paint or draw on top of. It should be big enough that you can include as much imagery as you like. After you've decided on the surface, or sometimes even before, because you might want to find a surface that makes sense for your topic, you're going to want to think about imagery that can go on top of that surface. So when you're thinking about the imagery, if it was on a dictionary page, maybe you want to think about the word that you could illustrate that exists already on that page. Or maybe if it's on a poem, it could be an illustration of that poem or a segment of the story from a page in a book or a novel. Or maybe if it was something like a map, it could be an illustration of a journey or an experience. You're going to want to plan out your composition and what kind of imagery you're going to superimpose on top of this before you actually do it. So just like any sort of artwork, we want to think about our composition and our arrangement before we actually draw on the surface. Tracing paper is a great way to draw and sketch on top of an image without damaging that surface. You really want to think about how the imagery is going to interact with the text or the images that already exist on the surface. And if you have to find any additional references, feel free to use your Chromebooks. So I wanted to show you a few examples. I think this one is probably pretty obvious what it is illustrating. But think about how it's much more than just one example of time. This artist has come up with many different examples of clock faces in order to create a really complex image. Sometimes students think, okay, I'm going to put a clock on top of the page and that's enough, but probably a little bit too basic for this lesson. Think about how you can leave the important text visible. Is it that you don't cover it up and that you highlight it in some sort of way? Can you circle the text? Can you draw around it so that you can isolate it? You can use the text that's on the page, but you can also incorporate more. So like on the dictionary page that you see here, this is maybe handwritten, but you can also use stamps. I have stencils, other ways of superimposing the imagery on the page. It could be even collaged from a magazine or a newspaper. When you are thinking about your story, think about a surface that will help to illustrate it. This one is based on a student's study abroad in Rome, and you can see that she used a Rome map as her background. Maybe you find the surface first, like maybe a newspaper, and then think about what kind of imagery would make sense on top of that surface. Maybe there's a story within it that can give you some ideas. Once you have thought about your story, you want to think about what medias you can use on top of it that will, one, be able to be viewed on top of it, like how it will actually adhere. Some surfaces, like I mentioned, like magazines, are really slick and it's really hard to get color pencil to stick to it. So things like marker and pen, paint might work best. You can also prep the surface, which I'll show you examples of later. But it's sometimes nice to play on transparency. So what medias will allow you to see the text? Good example is how you can still see and make out some of the text from those balloons. We have some different tricks that we can use to make some of the surfaces less obvious. So maybe you want to remove some of it. So we can use gesso, which is a painting primer. We could also use white paint or a tinted color. A tinted color would be a color with white in it because white is opaque and it covers up your imagery. When I'm planning using found imagery, instead of sketching it all out and then sketching it on top, what I will often use is tracing paper on top of the found surface so that I can figure out how I'm going to place the imagery. We can add color, we can vary things as we go, and then we'll add that final imagery on top of the found surfaces. Right? So we will continue to explore these concepts of how I can make my imagery and my meaning stand out as we move forward in the lesson. So here are some examples using the dictionary page. When I first started this lesson, I forced students to have to use one. And so here you can see it's pretty straightforward. This one is about watermelons. So based on a word that exists. A word could be a little bit more concept than actual thing. So here a student found the word summer and then found imagery that represented summer to them. This one's a little bit more tricky. You can see that the thought is a large concept. And so when you're thinking about imagery that would go on it, things that are a little bit broader are a little bit harder to define. But you really want to think about how you can create a complex image for a complex word. Here's another really difficult word that the student chose to illustrate. I think this is a great example of not only altering the found surface, right, drawing on it, adding color, adding imagery, but also then, once again, collaging into it. So the ticket stub and the film were also collaged into the surface. I hope that helps you, and then think if this is a good prompt for you.